I'm Vinnie Politan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight here on Closing Arguments. And here we are. It's been a long, long road. I'm talking about the Doomsday couple. I'm talking about little JJ. I'm talking about Tylee Ryan. I'm talking about Tammy Daybell. I'm talking about Charles Vallow as well. All these people dead. All these people losing their lives prematurely. Now, we know the trial against Lori. We know how that went. We know she's waiting for another one for the death of Charles. But it was really clear. And in the trial of Lori Vallow, there wasn't the fight in that trial because of who Lori is and where she is mentally. It just wasn't there. Now we're in the trial of Chad Daybell, and it's much different. It's much different. This is a real battle. This is a guy who does not want to be locked up anymore. This is a guy who certainly doesn't want to end up on death row, regardless of when he thinks the end times are coming. Does not want to be there. He wants to walk out of that courtroom and live the rest of his life. Will it happen? It'll be up to the jury to decide. But that decision is getting closer and closer because today the state rested. It was the end of the state's case. They put in all the evidence they believe they need to prove that Chad Daybell, the so-called Doomsday Prophet, is responsible for the murders of these two innocent children and his wife of 28 years, the wife who together they built this family. Think about the level of broken trust in that. Tammy Daybell had no idea. Someone tried to shoot and kill her in her driveway. And she has that as a paintball. Don't worry about it. It was nothing. Then she dies in the marital bed. The jury's going to have to make a decision here, and it's you know, on the one hand with Tammy Daybell, it's going to be about cause of death. And in the case of the two children, it's going to be, well, is Chad Daybell really responsible? Is he really connected to the death of JJ and Tylee? Was it really just Lori and her hitman brother? So today, inside the courtroom, prosecutors are finishing, and I'm a former prosecutor. You want to start big, you want to finish big. So they brought in some of the text messages between Chad and Lori, trying to bring in front of this jury those innermost thoughts and communications that they never thought would be public. The jury read them. I'll let you listen to them because two of my producers will read them.
I have been instructed to focus my efforts on Hillary, so I will.
Okay, find out her percentage for me and JJ's.
She is 0.13. I turned up the pain to 10 and placed a spiritual virus in her. He is 99.99. Raphael visited him and told him to follow Amy into the light. I also assured him that James would live and take care of his mommy, which he will, with all of his heart and soul.
That is sweet. I miss you desperately. When you get home, check Tylee. She is being super sweet and helpful, and she cleaned her room. See if she got switched. Totally not her.
Yes, she was switched. Please let me know when you can talk, and I will explain it. One question. Do you want me to cause pain yet to those 2 3s you're riding with?
Probably hold off on them until we arrive. They will be a big mistake to deal with. But I'll text you if they start acting up, and we can zap them.
Sounds great. Yes, if they are going to act up, we'll at least give them a reason to scream. I love, cherish, treasure, and adore you.
What is the percentage now? What about JJ's too?
Tammy is at 3, JJ is at 2. Both are being heavily shielded to stop intruders.
2 and 3%, not 0?
I will explain when we talk.
Okay, still feeling hot for you. Please check JJ. He just woke up saying crazy stuff, and you'll go back to sleep. He is talking to Blake. It's weird.
JJ is still JJ. I am told his spirit recognizes Blake as evil and is unsettled by him.
How is JJ now?
Yes, he's at 0. He probably was partly through the veil talking to people, both light and dark.
Do you think there is a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children, and we just have to wait for it to be carried out?
You are doing everything right, my love. The Lord told me she is right on track.
They're talking about the murder of 2 children. And Lori is saying, I'm so hot for you right now. This is sick, sick stuff. This is the kind of stuff that gets you on death row. But we'll see. It'll be up to the jury to figure it out. First, they've got to figure out if Chad is responsible for the death of those 2 children and the death of his wife. Kelly Craft was in Boise and has a report for us tonight on the end of the state's case.
Good evening, Vinny. The state has rested its case in chief against Chad Daybell. And also a big development here today when Judge Boyce made a ruling as to whether the charge against Chad Daybell for the murder of J.J. Vallow could stand. Ultimately, he ruled that it could. This was in regard to a clerical error on the indictment made by the state. The state said in its argument that, Judge Boyce, we are falling on our sword here. Judge Boyce said the date was incorrect on count 4 of the indictment, which is the first-degree murder for J.J. Vallow. The death dates listed were actually for Tylee Ryan. J.J. Vallow was presumed to have died between September 22nd and September 23rd. That's according to the prosecution theory. The state argued that case law would permit the judge to reopen the case in order for the state to amend the indictment. Defense counsel John Pryor, though, argued the state had 4 attorneys working on this case and missed its window to amend the indictment. So, Vinny, a lot of big developments here today in Boise, Idaho, and the judge again ruling that murder count for J.J. Vallow could stand. Defense counsel is going to put on a case that is expected to start on Monday. We'll send it back to you.
Kelly Craft in Boise, and Monday the defense case will start, and they'll have a case. They're going to have experts that are going to come in. I don't expect Chad Daybell to testify, but you never know. You never, ever know. He has to make that decision. All right, we have an incredible panel tonight. I want to bring in our guest, host of Tylee and JJ's Silver Linings podcast, author of the book Lori's Lies and Family Ties. Lori Vallow's brother, Adam Cox, is with us. Also joining us, licensed mental health and nationally certified clinician Sharonda Brown, and religious cult expert, retired police commander, host of the Profiling Evil podcast, and author of the book Deceived, Mike King is with us. Great to see everyone. Adam, I want to begin with you. Your sister, in the back and forth with Chad, the prophet, they're talking about the death of your niece and nephew, and she interjects in the middle of this conversation, I'm so hot for you right now. What's your reaction, your thoughts about that?
It's sickening, obviously, but you feel like with Lori and Chad's fantasy relationship as it developed, where, Chad, when he met Lori, said, hey, we were married in several lives before this. And he just, went down that whole road of this fantasy thing, and she just bought into it. So obviously throughout this whole thing with the dark spirits, who's going to a 0 and a 3, who can keep up with all that stuff? It's just it's insane. It really is insanity. And so, to have that relationship go back and forth and talking about all this fantasy, it's really hard to follow what their thought patterns were throughout this whole thing.
Sharonda Brown, I'm listening to the text messages. Obviously, the jury was reading them. But this back and forth between Chad and Lori, and I think Adam is right on here, like they're in their own world. But from my perspective, I feel like Lori's all in that world, and Chad is in enough to make sure that Lori stays hot for him.
Yes, absolutely. When people bond, they have to bond one over a common goal or a common idea. And it sounds like in this case, it was this spiritual realm, whether it was dark or evil, it was something that they bonded with. For them to agree with it, it has to be some positive reinforcement there. And that's what you hear when she's saying, I'm so hot for you. And it's like that positive reinforcement for, hey, you're doing really well. And so he kind of gives her the same positive reinforcement. And those things keep these behaviors going, and it makes them feel like there's only them in this world in which they operate in. This is what keeps the bond, and this is what makes them truly believe that they are both sworn to this secrecy, because only them two know what they're speaking on, and only them two are getting the positive gratification from it.
Mike King, great to see you tonight. You know, we've been covering this for so long, right? And right there, it seems in that text exchange is where I see Chad absolutely involved in the planning and plotting, or is it more manipulation? What's your take on that exchange involving, you know, the ultimate death/murders of these two children?
You know, from day one, we were wondering who's in charge, and I think they're both in charge in different little parallel universes. I think that Lori is using the things that she's pretty good at, the manipulative skills that she's good at, to keep him in line. He's using his prowess as a religious leader to keep reminding her that, hey, I'm something special, where maybe he doesn't feel like he's that special overall. And together, they're feeding off of each other like two junior high kids. And it's just crazy to watch this thing unfold. Because when he starts getting a little edgy, Vinny, she steps up and love bombs him a little more and lets him know how much he's desired and needed and wanted. And then when she's starting to get a little questioning, he's saying, hey, I just talked to God, and God told me this is going on, and you're on the right track, Lori. And together, this is absolutely fuel and flame. And these two together have created this little world that only they live in, and everyone else is just kind of satisfying fantasy. I think Adam said a great thing there, because it's fantasy where all these things are created. It has to be created up here first before you can create it here. And these two together are getting that fantasy going, and then pretty soon the fantasy's not cool enough, and you gotta act it out.
Now, the other part, Adam, as I look at this couple, and it's been difficult to truly understand, but I think after 2 trials now, I'm getting it a little bit more. Despite the fact that they're in this fantasy world together, they're still grounded in like what's happening here on Earth, you know, in the real world, because they know they need to flee Idaho because of the cops, right? They know that they've got to get a death certificate so they can bring that to the insurance company and get the money. And Lori is so angry with Charles' sister. I mean, that's the real world stuff that's happening, and they're not divorced from that. They're like living in both worlds at the same time.
Yeah, you said it right, Vinny. When you start thinking about this whole relationship and this whole case, it's a lot of fantasy, like we talked about, and Mike and I had talked about this in a podcast that we did. A lot of fantasy, but then there's also, like you said, the reality of it, because it's not just about Lori and Chad wanting to be together. There's money, there's sex, there's power, there's follow us, cult leader stuff. There's there's a variety of things all mixed into one. And that's why in this case, it's like an onion with, you peel one thing back and then there's something else that they contradict each other all the time throughout this whole thing. There's a ton of contradiction with what they believe and what they don't believe. They change it on a daily basis.
And you know what's hard to fathom, Sharonda, is that all this is so-called, all their beliefs are supposedly grounded in religion and God, right? And things like that. Yeah, you know, people are dying, though. People are dying, and to somehow rationalize that in their minds is what we see playing out in some of these text messages.
Yes, absolutely. When people are engaging in evil acts, so to speak, they have to tell themselves something to justify that. And these are the conversations that they're having with themselves. So if they think they're doing God's work, then who's to argue with that? Then they can sleep peacefully and they can do things according to God's plan. When actuality, it's totally self-motivated. And what we see is a lot of survival skills here. So you made a point about being in reality while still engaging in this fantasy. That's all survival stuff, because people will engage in survival mode to keep from, you know, getting caught up in shall I say, getting arrested or anything like that. Because if I can stay off the radar and I can stay into a sense of reality and it keeps me out of jail or keeps me able to flee or keeps me searching for money, then I can justify my actions by saying, okay, I'm trying to survive, but I also want this fantasy world. Because the fantasy world is what I'm yearning for, is what I'm reaching for. And we see this all the time with multiple criminals, not just cases like this, but you will see people engage in acts to stay on the radar, stay safe, but still do what they want and say that, hey, I was doing God's job, or I was really trying to save someone, or I was trying to save myself. So there's that mixture of two worlds. And you see this a lot with people who have self-motive intention.
You know, you talk about what you're describing here, though, from a legal perspective. If you're in a different state other than Idaho, which doesn't really recognize traditional legal insanity, which is, do you know the difference between right and wrong, right? Between good and bad. For Lori, if she was in a different state, she probably could have pleaded insanity and said she thought she was doing God's work in all of this, but you can't do that in Idaho. All right, our guests are staying with us. Up next. The Doomsday couple's relationship was fueled by money, sex, and power. But who had the real power behind closed doors? Chad or Lori? On the next episode of Accomplice to Murder.
This didn't seem like a random crime.
The shooting seemed personal.
Hemi Newman was certainly the last person suspected something like this.
Hemi was manipulated.
They wanted to indict Andrea as the mastermind behind her husband's murder.
What clearly was an affair.
There was no affair. Who killed someone else's husband?
Accomplice to Murder with Vanny Politan. All new episode, Sunday night, 8, 7 Central.
Only on Court TV.
He used to be a really nice guy. You know, I was initially pretty shocked in some ways about the news reports. I did not think it was possible that Chad could hurt Tammy at all or any children. He was a good husband and a good father by everything I could see.
Chad Daybell on the murder, on trial for the murder of his wife, Tammy, his wife of 28 years, and the children of his new wife, Lori. When you look at this couple, we refer to them, and we have, as the Doomsday couple, but that relationship, extremely complicated, extremely nuanced, and often difficult to truly understand because of how bizarre a lot of it is, how deadly so much of it is, and you try to get to the bottom of it all. We're going to try to do that, but first let's hear from Matt Johnson telling us a little bit more about Chad Daybell.
Is Lori Noreen Vallow not guilty or guilty of first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan, of Joshua Jackson Vallow, of Tammy Daybell? Answer, guilty.
In May 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty by an Idaho jury for the murders of her children, Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, and conspiring to kill her husband's first wife, Tammy.
Chad, call me. I'm going to tell you what you fixing to get, boy.
I think the evidence is stronger against him.
Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Husband Chad faces the death penalty if he's convicted.
Chad, where are Lori's kids? What happened to Tammy, Chad?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell were married to other people when they met at a spiritual conference and began an affair in 2018.
No, she was into him. She was way into Chad. She was infatuated with him, big time.
By the end of 2019, her husband and his wife were both dead. Her kids were missing, they were married, and their friends were concerned.
I was wondering, where are you guys?
We're just hanging out.
That was the perfect storm when she met Chad.
Tylee and JJ's remains were found 6 months later, buried in the backyard of Chad's home.
Chad Daybell was taken into custody and booked into the Fremont County Jail.
Prosecutors had planned to try the cases together, but when Chad waived his right to a speedy trial, Lori's case went first.
This was all a plan. Like I said at the beginning, a plan for them to be together without obstacles. And those obstacles were Tylee Ryan, JJ Vallow, and their spouses, Charles Vallow and Tammy Daybell.
During her trial, the state claimed that Lori was the mastermind behind the murders and manipulated Chad through emotional and sexual control. Her defense argues that Chad was the mastermind.
Is Lori a leader or is she a follower of Chad? She still wants to be a leader, but she's not leading anyone. She's following Chad.
Chad Daybell didn't testify at Lori's murder trial, and his defense is expected to blame her as he faces the death penalty.
I can just about guarantee everybody right now, Chad's attorneys are going to throw her under, not a bus, but a steamroller.
So who had the power, like behind closed doors in this relationship? Who's the mastermind? Let's bring back in our guests, Adam Cox, Sharonda Brown, Mike King. Mike, I'll start with you.
I think it is a dual ownership on this one. And often in these cults, Vinny, you see one leader, sometimes charismatic, but really one person that everybody points to that makes all the decisions. But I think once these two got together, they started really working as a team in getting other people who followed them to believe in some of these concepts. But when it comes to the two of them, Vinny, I really think the state's done a great job of pointing to Chad as the one that was coming up with all the religious doctrine, that was giving all the justification. Because most people are going to say, hey, I don't think killing somebody's right. But boy, you introduce God into this and say, hey, God is telling me I got to do this. Then people will step up and do things that they might never do in another circumstance.
Sharonda Brown, is it possible in a relationship as diabolical as this one was, as bizarre as this one was, that there's a level of shared power? Or do you think one has a little more control than the other? One is pulling the strings a little bit more.
I think in that type of relationship, everybody plays their part. You have this leader of God who man is, and I think for the most part, people who are in religion, they will say, hey, man represents, the order from God. And so then you have woman who is that supporter. So he may have been the religious aspect or the one that says, hey, God has said this we need to do. But she also, may have been that sexual piece. And that is maybe where sometimes her manipulation lies, and especially if he has low self-esteem or if he doesn't believe that he is as desirable, and especially if he's a people pleaser. So those are ways that she may have used her power, because I can't help but think his children were still alive and they think so highly of him. And we saw that before early in the case where they just really could not see anything wrong in his behaviors at all. And prior to her coming on the scene, her husband was already murdered. So there is a lot there that says they equally may have had an influence, but for very different reasons. So I think that there's just a difference in power depending upon what the motive was, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. As much as you can make sense of these two. Adam, I want you to take a listen to your nephew, Colby Ryan, and his take on this issue.
Do you believe your mother was influenced by Chad Daybell?
Objection, Judge.
Grounds?
It's speculation. There's no foundation to base what he's basing this on.
It's a question of belief. It's overruled.
100%. I think she could be influenced, yes.
Adam, what do you think?
Oh, well, if you go back with Chad, Lori's not the first woman that he approached and said that he was married to and all these probations. And I think there was other women that he mentioned, like, well, to be part of this thing, there's no kids involved. And I thought I heard one woman say that when she heard that, she was out. So obviously Chad had something going on with, coming up with this line to women. And unfortunately, Lori was in a position where she thought that he was special and he was the guy from God, and she was doing her part because she wanted to be something special with religion and be in favor of God. All those things went through her head at some point. Obviously, she turned and went off the wall with him. But yeah, obviously, he had a huge impact on all this, the way it went down.
Mike, I want you to take a listen to Chad's mom talking about her son.
gregarious. Do you understand what the word gregarious means? Yes. Okay. Yes. He's not a gregarious personality, is he?
No.
He met Tammy at a relatively young age.
Yes.
And they got married very young.
Yes.
Your son Chad is not necessarily a man of the world, right?
Not worldly.
So he didn't have like a lot of experience in dealing with relationships or anything like that, correct?
No.
In fact, Tammy was really his only ever real serious relationship.
Yes.
And that's the woman he married.
Yes.
Now, if we fast forward to Lori Vallow, she was a different personality, a much more dynamic personality, correct?
Yes.
Let me ask you, Mike, when it comes to this, this romantic side of this relationship, Lori comes with a lot more experience. I mean, she'd been married several times before. Do you think she held any power over Chad, at least on that aspect of the relationship?
I think absolutely, Vinny. I think he had his heart Twitter patterned, and he was overwhelmed with the fact that someone who he perceived to be beautiful and really something was paying attention to him and telling him how great he was and feeding into his own belief system that he was some celestial being that was going to be able to do things. She was giving him what he wasn't getting anywhere else, which is common sense. And that thing really bothers me when you think about her history and the fact that, she was learning some lessons along the way, whether she intended to learn those or planned on those. She learned with Joe Ryan that there was a money stream attached to his death. She learned with Charles Vallow that there should have been a money stream attached to his death, but thankfully that guy was smart enough to give Kay access and responsibility over that money. So that when you start pushing toward Tammy Daybell, and you see that there was a money train and an increase in life insurance and an immediate request just days after, the first business day after her death, I think there was a lot of education going both ways. But I think this guy was overwhelmed by the attention he was getting, and she knew it, and she was able to control him in that way. But he gave her something that she wasn't getting anywhere else. He somehow impressed upon her that he was in tune with God, and he could give her a one-way ticket up to heaven and to all kinds of power and control.
I want to listen to Special Agent Doug Hart here describing Lori as a mother before and after Chad.
Isn't it true that Lori was, for all intents and purposes, a pretty good mother?
With the exception of what happened to her children, yes.
All right. And based on your review of the text as a whole, Lori seemed to have led a pretty normal life until she met Chad Daybell. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say so.
Sharonda Brown, is it possible for a good mom to turn bad because of a man that she meets?
Absolutely. Especially if she's already coming into it with her own low self-esteem and truly believes that her identity is found in man. So yes, you can actually be a good mom and then decide, hey, I am not that anymore. I'll sacrifice that if it means having this man in my life. We see it all the time. And I think what's most important is that he too struggled with the same thing. So when you have two people stirring the same type of pot, you're going to get a disaster such as this one. So yeah, I definitely think that is very, very possible. Now, I do think that there's a prerequisite for that, meaning she has to not really care too much for herself or her well-being to be as vulnerable in those type of situations. So I do think that there was already something brewing for her to even be open to a man such as Chad.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what Adam said. All right, everyone's staying with us. We've got more to get to up next. Chad Daybell's followers were true believers in his prophecies about the end times. Who are these women? We'll take a closer look. There's Chad Daybell in all his glory. A room full of women, followers, people who are believing his prophecies about the end times. That's who he was. And that's when life changed for him. And that's when life seemingly ended for his wife, Tammy. Chad Daybell had followers. He had like real followers, people who believed in this guy. You know, we've listened to him a little bit. Doesn't seem super dynamic, but he wrote all these books. He went to these conventions, and he ended up garnering a following. But who exactly were these people? Let's take a look.
Were you ever involved in or brought into that gathering of the 144,000?
Well, she would indicate that the girls that she knew were part of it. It wasn't given to us as knowledge on our own, just as what she believed and Chad believed.
Okay. And did you believe that you were part of the 144,000?
I wasn't sure. I didn't feel like it, but they kept trying to convince me that I was, but I didn't feel that calling ever.
Okay. But you were involved in what they call what has been referred to as castings. Is that right?
Correct.
So when Chad Daybell told you that in a previous life your name was Joanna and you had been married to Jesus, what did you think of that?
At the time, I thought it could be true because I trusted him.
I have become a lot more cautious since meeting Chad and Lori, and my views have changed a little in regards to that.
Okay, so when you met Chad and Lori, you thought they were doing good work.
I thought they were kind, loving, righteous, law-abiding.
Did you believe that they were led by the Spirit?
At the time, yes.
More than anything, I feel like Melanie was manipulated and taken advantage of in one of the most difficult and dark times in her life. She was telling her, that Brandon's dark, that law enforcement officers that Melanie should have been cooperating with were dark, translated beings, that they were out to get them, that they were impeding their holy mission. When in reality, these officers were trying to find two missing children, find out what had happened with the shooting of Brandon Boudreaux.
It's real. It's real. These women really believed. Sharonda, let's talk a little bit about that. It seems like, I'm no expert, obviously, that's why I have all of you on here tonight, but everyone's looking for something. Everyone's looking for something. At least these folks were, I think.
Yes. Acceptance is really, really important for a lot of people. It gives them self-esteem. It gives them confidence. People participate in groupthink for the sake of being popular and for the sake of being accepted. And what groupthink is when people will go along with the thought for the sake of the group. Because if they don't, they'll be ostracized, they'll feel alone. So when you're lonely and you have that desperation, that is a bad combination with wanting to be a part of a group. So people will definitely give up their thoughts, their beliefs. They'll forget they have their own brains and ideas for the sake of being accepted. Because to be a part of something that leaves you standing by yourself is what is a lot of people's biggest fear.
Adam, you were actually recruited by your sister?
Not really recruited. She tried to get me to read some that Vision of Glory's book and try to ask me to listen to some podcasts, which I was told her, I was like, I'm not interested in any of that stuff. So obviously right off the bat, I was I get enough church. I don't need extra church. So I didn't try even to listen or understand any of it. So I'm probably not the right person to ask about that stuff, because I never gave it any attention at all.
That's because you were dark, probably, right?
Yeah, apparently at one point I think that Chad had me at a light, and then when I didn't listen to anything that they wanted me to listen to, or Lori, I didn't even know Chad at the time, and so then apparently I went to the dark side. So I think anytime that you do not agree with them, or if you say something that's not what, or don't believe what they say, you automatically will get on a dark list, apparently.
Mike King, I know you've spent a lot of your professional years looking at and examining cults and the mentality and everything that goes into it. This won't be the first, it won't be the last, but what's your real takeaway from the followers of Chad Daybell?
I think they had like-minded ideologies, Vinny. I think they were looking for something more than anyone else had. They wanted to have more light and knowledge. They wanted to have a closer connection with whatever God it is that they believed in. They want to have more power and control, and they want to have this sense that they are somehow a little bit higher elevation or a little bit more elevated than the people around them. And I'll tell you, you hear these people coming up with all these wild ideas, like they're having visions and they're talking to spirits. And it takes me back to the kids in the Zion Society when they used to get stuck in a room and they were told you can't come out until you've connected with somebody on the other side, your guardian angel, who's given you some form of advice. And they later in their years would say, well, we were making up stuff just to get over it. But what was happening is something really critical. They were starting to conform rather than feel the ostracization or the separation. The love bombing was more important. Being pulled into the group and being one was a whole lot more important than saying, hey, this doesn't sound right, and all of this is not making sense to me. So unless you become more spiritual, you're going to be left out, and nobody wants to be left out.
No one, yeah, exactly. You want to be part of this group, and it becomes so dangerous. It became so dangerous, and in this case, it became deadly for those around Chad and Lori. But I'm still, to me, it's about, the obstacles. Like, Chad wanted to be with Lori, Lori wanted to be with Chad, everything else fall by the wayside, but they needed money to do that. They needed money to that. Wasn't selling enough of those books, right? Wasn't, just so many of those you can sell. Right? The market isn't that big. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Adam Cox, Sharonda Brown, Mike King, great to see you all. I'm sure we'll speak again as this trial draws to a close. Again, the state rested today. We've got more to get to.